prairie-based river in the world, 173 miles long. And her role as a Kansas river keeper is that it's a non-governmental public advocate that works to protect and preserve the Kansas River. This is accomplished through holding the community accountable for the health of the river, working to resolve pollution concerns about the river, advocating for the river and its environs, educating the public, and providing outreach activities to get people involved in the river. Dawn herself holds a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources, Fish and Wildlife Conservation from Oregon State University, and a Bachelor in Business Administration from Baker University. As mentioned, she serves on the Kansas Basin Regional Advisory Committee for the Kansas Water Vision and is the governor's appointee for the Oil and Gas Advisory Committee. Dawn is also active on the board of directors of the Kansas Land Trust and the board of directors for the Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams. So let's all hold our hands in front of the camera and clap. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Dawn.
Thank you. Good morning. It's good to see you all. It's been rather individual, hasn't it been? It's been challenging for us to get through this pandemic. I think individually and with work, I'm fortunate that I pretty much work out of my home, and so not a lot has changed for me. I've still spent some time out on the river, socially distanced, of course, not with groups like I usually do, but even that has been reduced with the stay-home order. So my husband and I live south of Eudora. In fact, we don't live very far from Penny, and we've just enjoyed our little place, enjoying nature and our animals, and getting outside every day and finding ways to connect. So I'm going to get started. It's good to see you all this morning. I'm going to start with sharing my screen. I have just a short presentation. Sarah, can you remind me of what time you would like me to wrap up?
Graham, do you have a particular time?
I'd say that she's got 30 minutes to go.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do for Friends of the Kaw and what it means to be a Kansas river keeper. It's kind of a unique title. I'm also the executive director of Friends of the Kaw, which is 501c3 nonprofit. So I'm going to start off with this beautiful shot of the Kansas River. This is drone footage taken by Lisa Grossman. If many of you are from Lawrence, you may know her and be familiar with her art. She paints the Kansas River and the tallgrass prairie. And this is drone footage that she took last year when the flooding was starting on the Kansas River. It's been a really challenging time for everyone, hasn't it? Last summer, we had all of that flooding all year long. And this year we're starting off with the pandemic. So I do believe, though, brighter days are ahead. So a little bit about our mission. Our mission is to protect and preserve the Kansas River. We advocate for the rehabilitation of the Kansas River environs, which includes its water quality and wildlife habitat. We promote recreational use of the river. And we work with many different agencies and groups to accomplish these things. So I'm going to start off with and share with you a little bit about what is a river keeper. I get asked that question a lot. Folks are interested in what does that mean and what do you do? So to give you an overview, so Friends of the Kaw is the nonprofit locally. It was started in the early 90s in Lawrence. In fact, next year we're going to celebrate our 30th year, which we are really excited about. It was started by a group of local activists who were concerned about dredging on the Kansas River. And so we've been around for quite a while, but in the early 2000s, Friends of the Kaw joined the Global Waterkeeper Alliance. And Waterkeeper Alliance is a network of over 300 water keepers, coastal keepers, bay keepers, any type of a keeper of water. And so when they joined Waterkeeper Alliance, that allowed them to use the trademark name Kansas River Keeper. And that is a non-governmental public advocate who holds the community accountable for the health of the river. So imagine it's like the ears, the eyes, the voice of the river. So I think of it this way. I go to a lot of meetings, whether they are at the county level, the state level, the city level, just community events. And my job in the role of the Kansas River Keeper is to be the one that holds up my hand and says, wait, what about the Kansas River when we're having discussions? And so there might be something that's going to happen along the river, and my job would be to say, how are we going to make sure that we protect the river, particularly the drinking water supply of over 800,000 Kansans. So this is the trademark Waterkeeper Alliance that I talked to you about. So it's really great to be a member of Waterkeeper Alliance. They have a lot of training that they provide us with, legal expertise, a lot of national efforts to do public comments. So it's a lot of work to stay on top of all of the changing regulations with the Clean Water Act and now NEPA and some of these other different rules through the Environmental Protection Agency. And so Waterkeeper Alliance will put their legal staff and put together briefs and allow all of the different water keepers to sign on. And so what that does is it allows us to have one global voice and allows us to utilize the strength of their legal team. So you'll often see us post on our social media about something that involves Waterkeeper Alliance. That's our membership with them and our work to try and be supportive on a more national level. Most of what we do is very local, but we do participate in national things through Waterkeeper Alliance. So here's, this is on the right is a picture of me on a Kansas River sandbar. And that's probably one of my favorite things about my job is actually getting people out on the Kansas River. But what does the river keeper do? So the very first thing is to hold the community accountable for the health of the river, participate in public meetings, monitor the river with what we call river checks. If you follow us at all on social media, you'll often see that we post pictures and we'll say, we're out doing a river check today. And well, what is a river check? A river check is really being on the river and present in a particular section of the river. So the boat ramps are about 10 miles apart. So usually it's a 10-mile section of the river, and checking the river for any pollution, for any dumping, illegal dumping, for anything that we see that doesn't look right and needs to be investigated. And you all probably know this, but we're the only ones that are out there checking the health of the Kansas River. The Corps of Engineers isn't out there. None of the agencies are out there. They don't have the staff, first of all, to do that. So for example, we did a river check right before the stay home order between Lawrence and Eudora. We found a fresh dump site, which we turned in to the county and to the state. We found some old pipes that are no longer used that were under the river at one time, and because of all the flooding, they've now surfaced. And so we're working on trying to advocate how those are going to be handled because they are a hazard for boaters, among other things. So each time that we do a river check, we find things that we need to investigate. So I advocate on behalf of the Kansas River locally and at the State House, a media spokesperson, and managing our efforts for advocating. So these are some of our advocacy efforts that we're working on right now. So I am on the Regional Advisory Committee for the Kansas Water Vision. The Kansas Water Vision is a group of Well, the regional advisory committees, there's 14 of us across the state. And if you see this picture up here in the corner of the state of Kansas, this little swath right here that says Kansas, right here, that's the Kansas Basin Regional Advisory Committee, which is where Lawrence is located. And most of the Kansas River watershed, not all of it, because you'll see here in a minute, the Kansas River watershed covers almost the entire upper half of Kansas, and as well as Nebraska and Colorado. So this little area here is the area that I work in on the water vision. So we set goals and action plans to protect water quality and water quantity for this region of Kansas. And everyone who's on the Regional Advisory Committee is a volunteer. We all represent some sector. For example, someone might represent farming, someone might represent municipalities. I represent recreation on the committee. Someone represents conservation. So we are actively working on ways to set goals and action plans around the Kansas Basin. And also we work on trying to find ways to fully fund the Kansas State Water Plan. I was also appointed to the Oil and Gas Advisory Committee by Governor Kelly. So that's a new role for me since last December. So I'm still learning a lot, but I've dove in and am working on that. If you have more questions about it, you're welcome to ask me about it offline. I am also on the Lower Kansas Stakeholder Leadership Team for the RAPS. And the RAPS is an acronym that stands for Water Restoration and Protection Strategy. And basically, this is a program where we work with landowners to install conservation practices that protect water quality. So the Lower Kansas RAPS is around the Stranger Creek area. Leavenworth County is a really a county that's has a lot of cattle farms and a lot of ranching. And so one of our goals with this group is that Stranger Creek is impaired for bacteria. And we know that there's a lot of cattle in the creeks. So we use this cost share program to help landowners move their cattle out of the creek, provide an alternate water source in the uplands. And some of our testing has shown that as soon as that's done, we see a drastic improvement in the water quality of that river. So I work on that group. I'm also on the Topeka Riverfront Advisory Committee, where we're working on developing the riverfront through Topeka. And then the Sustainable Rivers Program, which is a program for the Kansas River, where we're working to reoperate core dams to have more ecological flows on the Kansas River. So those are all some of our big advocacy efforts. And if any of you would like to learn more about those, I'd be happy to chat with you about them. Each one is quite detailed and has a lot of things happening. So in the interest of time, I won't go through each one of those. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about just a quick overview of our programs, because we have a lot of different programs that we work on, but these are our signature programs. We have an Adopt a Boat Ramp program where local community groups will adopt their local boat ramp along the Kansas River, and that involves cleaning up trash once a quarter. We're probably most known for our educational paddle trip program. That's where we work with high school and college science classes mostly to do educational paddle trips on the Kansas River. We also do 4 or 5 public events a year where we try and get the general public out. But many of our programs are with KU classes, field ecology classes, K-State classes, Haskell, Indian Nations, Johnson County Community College, even UMKC comes out and uses the Kansas River sandbars to teach about sediment. We do a lot of water quality testing with these groups, and then high school classes. If you're familiar, in Lawrence, Julie Schwarting teaches environmental science at Free State High School, and every year we take one of her classes out on the Kansas River to educate, to use it as an outdoor classroom. We also do cleanups. We're the only group that's cleaning up the Kansas River. We have big cleanups. If you've been following us, you know that we had a cleanup planned for the middle of the Kansas River, just west of the Eudora Bridge. We were going to clean up over 400 tires that are embedded in a sandbar. And that has been delayed due to social distancing. But as soon as we can, we're going to get those out. That's a really neat cleanup project because we got a grant from REI from Overland Park to help us with it. But we have our volunteers, which are called Kaw River Guides, that are going to help us get those out of the sandbar. Then we have a group of fishermen that are from Eudora and Lawrence that have pledged the use of their boats to haul those tires back to the boat ramp. Evergy Green Team has committed to using their equipment to haul all the tires up the ramp. The city of Eudora is going to allow us to stack all the tires there on city property. And then Big O Tire out of Lawrence is providing a recycler that's coming to pick up all the tires and take them to a recycling facility. So it's a really neat project. We're hoping to get this done yet this year. Hopefully the situation will allow us to do that. We also have ecosystem restoration programs. Right now we have the Riverbank Restoration Project in Lawrence, where we have restored a mile of riverbank on city-owned property. We've removed invasive species and planted native plants to protect water quality. That project's almost done. We're supposed to be done with it at the end of June, and it was funded by the Heritage Conservation Council through Douglas County. Then the last two programs are our Kids About Water and our Water's Journey program. Those are both programs in school districts, grades 6 through 12. We actually take kids streamside and teach them how to test water. So they'll test for, nitrogen, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen. They'll seine for macroinvertebrates and learn about which ones are indicators of good water quality versus bad. So it's a really popular program. COVID-19 derailed, like many of us, our plans for the spring. We were supposed to present our Kids About Water program to 53 classes this spring. That's a lot of students. And so we worked with our grant funders and our education coordinator, and we took our Kids About Water program and we have turned it into a virtual program, and we delivered it to Lawrence High School last Friday so that the teachers could use it as part of their curriculum for the rest of the semester with their students. So we were really, we worked really hard on that. It took us about 3 weeks to move it all to an online format, but we were able to do that. We also had about 22 events for the month of April and half of May so far that have been canceled, all with lots of interaction with lots of people. So hopefully we'll get to reschedule those as well. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit here about the Kansas River watershed, just to give you some fun information to take back with you, maybe to talk about over coffee. So the river is home to a wide variety of plants and animals. There are a record 27 nesting pair of bald eagles on the Kansas River, a record. And there's never a time that I'm on the Kansas River that I don't see bald eagles. I also see a lot of big blue heron. We see the pileated woodpeckers sometimes. We see kingfishers, lots of kingfishers. I was out a few weeks ago, and the river has dropped, and so the sandbars are emerging. And there was some pretty shallow water, just a few inches deep, and just floating along, and watched a kingfisher. He would dive and get some food and go back up and dive, and kept coming back. And he was working right there in the shallow water. I'm sure he was fishing. We found otter tracks finally on the Kansas River. We've often heard that there were lots of otters on the Kansas River, but we really wanted to see proof. The sandbars, the water comes up and it washes away prints and goes off. And so we were patient. It took us several years, but we finally found otter tracks. We also see lots of beaver. the beaver dens in the sides of the river, lots and lots of beaver. When the river's low, you'll see deer run across, they'll skip across the river from sandbar to sandbar. So there's lots and lots of wildlife. We have had many classes where we've taken seining nets, they're kick nets, and you put them on the backside of a shallow sandbar. And if any of you are familiar, you can seine and you can actually catch small fish fry. And so we'll see little fish fry about yay big. And the river is just teeming with wildlife. There's so much out there. So it's wonderful to see that there's lots to explore. There are 10 counties that are along the Kansas River. We know that we have urban communities, farming communities. There's hydropower generated at Bowersock. The river generates electricity. There are 3 power plants on the Kansas River. One of them is being decommissioned, the one at Tecumseh. It's in the process of being decommissioned. And we've been told by Evergy that Lawrence Energy Center is next, that it's going to be decommissioned here before long. So I do see that they're moving more and more towards wind energy, which is good for the Kansas River. This is just a slide just to reinforce what I told you earlier, that the Kansas River is a drinking water source for over 800,000 Kansans. So people get their water from various places, but along the Kansas River, you can get it from the surface water of the Kansas River. You can get it from the alluvial aquifers. It depends on the community. So Lawrence, for example, the drinking water comes from the surface water of the Kansas River, and then a secondary source from Clinton Reservoir. The city of Topeka, for example, their only source of drinking water is the surface water of the Kansas River. The city of Eudora, down in that part of the watershed where I'm at, they get their water from wells in the alluvial aquifer. I actually live about 7 or 8 miles south of Eudora, and I was surprised when we moved here to learn that my water actually comes from Clinton Reservoir, because I have a rural water district that buys their water from there. So it's interesting to learn all the different ways that people get their water. Oops, wrong way. This is the Kansas River watershed. Most people are surprised to learn how big it is. It's 61,000 square miles. So you can see the white line up here, this white line and this white line, that's the state line. So this here is the entire upper half of Kansas, except for up here in the corner, that northeast corner where we have the little jig-jag. That's actually, there's a little portion up there around Atchison that drains straight to the Missouri River. And then the rest of it drains to the Kansas River. Central Nebraska, eastern Colorado. From a show of hands, how many of you have been to Lyman, Colorado, right? So Lyman is the farthest easternmost point of the Kansas River watershed. So what's interesting is, I don't know if you can see my pointer here, but this spot right here, that is around Junction City. Junction City is called Junction City because it's where 2 rivers meet. The Republican River and the Smoky Hill River meet, and that's where the Kansas River starts, and it flows 173 miles to where it meets the Missouri River in Kansas City. So this right here is the Kansas River right along here. So look at this huge area that drains. And when it drains, friends, right, it brings all of the pollution with it. So whatever we've left on the ground, we call that non-point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is everything that comes off when it rains. We're talking about waste from our pets or from feedlots. We're talking about oil that leaks from our cars. Anything that we were to put on the ground that winds up on the ground, it'll make its way into our rivers and streams. So in Junction City, where these 2 rivers meet, the Republican River actually comes down out of Nebraska, but not before the tributaries extend all the way out here. My son lives right out here in Thomas County, and just north of there are a couple of the forks, the North and South Fork of the Republican River. And then just south of there, down in Logan County, is actually the Smoky Hill River. And in some places, it's not very wide, but it's surrounded by grasslands and it's absolutely beautiful. But those two rivers come across and they meet, and that's where the Kansas River starts. Now, the upper end of the Kansas River, from Junction City down to Manhattan, which is right about here. So this area here is very narrow. It's really narrow, more like the Smoky Hill River. It behaves more like the Smoky Hill. The flow of the river in that part is very different than it is on the lower end because it's narrower, and so the river runs faster. It's more flashy. You know, the cubic feet per second is how fast water flows, and the cubic feet per second on the upper end is very different than it is on the lower end. Now this right here, this long skinny blue thing, this is Tuttle Creek Reservoir, which is damming the Big Blue River. This one back here at Junction City, this is Milford Reservoir that dams the Republican River. Down here, this is, if you can see this blue dot here, this is Perry Reservoir that dams the Delaware. And then right down here on the bottom, this is Clinton Reservoir that dams the Wakarusa River. So if you go back to Manhattan, to this long, skinny Tuttle Creek Reservoir, this is where the real changes start to happen in the Kansas River. If you look here at the river, it all of a sudden gets really wide. And this is the influence of all of the water, all of this water up here that's being drained right down into the Big Blue River. We call Tuttle Creek Reservoir the workhorse of the Kansas River because it has such an impact on the flows. Oftentimes people will say, well, I don't understand why the Kansas River is so high. It's not rained here. It doesn't have to rain here. If it rains anywhere out here, it's going to impact the Kansas River, and specifically this central Nebraska area. If you watched last year, I would take the radar of the storm systems and screenshot it on my phone. And the water, the rain would come out of western Kansas, it would rise up into central Nebraska, drop back down into Kansas City, and it just nailed this area right here above Manhattan over and over and over. And Tuttle Creek just filled very quickly. We weren't able to let any water out because the Missouri River was flooded. So our reservoirs all went up to full capacity. But we often do call this the workhorse because it has such an impact. If you've been on the Kansas River, or if you've just seen it from a boat ramp, when you get down to around Lecompton, all of a sudden the river gets really wide. People are often just amazed at how wide it gets. And so the flow of the river at Lecompton versus the flow up at Junction City are vastly different. You could have the same number. You could say 4,000 cubic feet per second here and 4,000 here on the same river, but it's very different. And that is because of how wide the river is. Down in Lecompton, when you're at 4,000 cubic feet per second, it's so much wider. People often say, well, I'm getting stuck on sandbars. So it's a very different experience. And then as you get down towards Kansas City, in Johnson County, from the 435 bridge that goes over the Kansas River, from there all the way down to Kansas City, we have so heavily dredged the Kansas River for sand. There are no sandbars. It looks like more like a big drainage ditch than the rest of the river that looks more like a prairie river. So it's very, very different in the different areas of the river. I often refer to it as the lower, the middle, and the upper. Upper meaning Topeka and above, Topeka down to say, you know, DeSoto area, and then it drastically changes from there. And a lot of it has to do with the dredging. So this is just a quick photo of how reservoir water and river water are intimately connected. I often have folks say, and I show this for this reason, is to try and change this perception that we have. And you know, people will say, well, I love to go fishing in Milford Reservoir, or I love to go skiing in Tuttle Creek Lake, but I don't want to touch the river of the Kansas River water. I said, well, number one, your drinking water in most cases is coming from the Kansas River. And number two, those reservoirs heavily feed the Kansas River. So when there's a big rain event, sure, I'm with you. I'm not really interested in the water quality at that point because we're taking everything off of our watershed. But during non-rain events, our river is being fed by those reservoirs. So it's reservoir water that's coming into the Kansas River. And you can see down to the sandbar. It's almost very clear. And that's because all the sediment's being held back behind all of those dams. When I was a kid, I grew up on the river on a farm with my family, and I spent an enormous amount of time on the Kansas River. And my sister and I would go fishing with my dad, and we would put our hands, you know, we were little, we weren't interested in being patient for fishing. So we would play in the water. And I can remember mud dripping off my hands every time I put them. It was like chocolate soup water. And now the river is very different with the influence of all of these dam systems. So these are some of our challenges. We talked about pollution, land use changes, agriculture. The introduction of no-till and cover crops has greatly benefited the Kansas River. Dredging for sand is still a challenge for us. And of course, climate change. We're seeing a lot of effects of that. We saw it last year with all of the flooding on the river. So here's some connections I hope to have helped create for you. The Kaw is a drinking water source for over 800,000 Kansans. The water quality of the entire watershed impacts what you drink. So when you think about that 61,000 square mile watershed, that's a big area, but that impacts our drinking water. The river is a reflection of how we use the land and the quality of the water coming out of those major reservoirs because they truly feed the system in non-rain times. Prevention starts with education. We believe it matters at every age and every stage. And we totally believe that connecting people back to a place where they can have an experience in nature helps them better understand it and want to help you protect it. These are some of our volunteers. If anyone's ever interested, we have Kaw River guides, which help us out on the river. We have people that come and help us table at events, help us with cleanups. And also, if you're a retired educator, or if you have an interest in water quality education, we're always looking for people to help us with our education program. Most of it, almost everything we do involves our volunteer base. There's only 3 of us. Myself, I work full-time, 2 other people that work part-time, and then we usually have an intern. And everything else, I mean, if you think about how much we do, it's done with our volunteer base. We have about 300 people on our volunteer list. And if it weren't for our volunteers, I'm not sure what we'd get done because we really, really rely on the strength of our volunteer base. These are our Kaw River guides. We are a membership-based organization. If you'd like to become a member, we'd love to have you. We do have members-only events about once a quarter. Unfortunately, we had to cancel our one in March, and it was a good one. We were partnering with the KU Museum of Natural History, and we were going to have mammalogists and paleontologists come and talk to our members about the bones that they find on the Kansas River. I was so excited about that one. Our members had been asking for it, but we will reschedule that. We have one tentatively planned for June, although I have my doubts if we'll be able to have it by then, but we're planning on doing a members event with the fisheries biologists from Wildlife and Parks. They were going to talk about the Asian carp on the Kansas River and about some of their sampling opportunities. So anyway, those are some things we hope to have come up before long. These are our 2 big advocacy events a year. These are our fundraisers. The Wild and Scenic Film Festival is the last week of every February, and Beers of the Kaw is November 1st this year, which is a beer tasting of all the breweries in the Kansas River watershed. So we use beer. This is pretty cool. We use beer to teach people about the watershed. So we have a big map, and we put all the breweries in the Kansas River watershed on it. And we use that to try and help educate and as a fundraiser. So this is our website, kansasriver.org. There's so much information on there. I hope that you'll go and have a look and look around. We do have what's called a river access map. And on that river access map, you can see every single boat ramp. There's pictures, there's information, all kinds of really neat information there. And with that, there's my contact information. And I would like to thank you all. And if anyone has any questions, or I'm not sure how you want to do that, Sarah, but I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go